Welcome back to Conversations from the Collection. I'm Zana Kobayashi, and we are delighted to bring you another bonus episode. This time with author, artist and fine art conservator Christabel Blackman and Newcastle Art Gallery's head of Curatorial and Exhibitions, Miriam Kelly. This was recorded live as part of the Newcastle Writers Festival 2025, where Christabel was celebrating the release of her book, Charles and Barbara Blackman, A Decade of Art and Love. In this conversation, we get a unique insight into the Blackman family household as Christabel shares beautiful stories about her parents, who were both influential figures in Australian art. She tells us a story of how a box of love letters set her off on a 5-year journey to document her parents' relationship and their burgeoning careers in the 1950s. We also learn about Christabel's own art practice and her training and work as a fine art conservator in Florence and Valencia. Please enjoy Miriam Kelly and Christabel Blackman in conversation.
I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we meet here today on the lands of the Awabakal and Worimi people. I pay my deepest respects to ancestors past and present and to all First Nations people who might be joining us today. This is really an event to celebrate, a really stunning book that Christabel has shared with us. It was published at the end of last year, and I believe you've spoken in a number of places around Australia so far, but we are really thrilled to have you here in Newcastle. By way of, I think, brief introduction, hopefully I can hand over to you for your own introduction, but Christabel Blackman is perhaps what the art world might call the triple threat. We have an artist who has exhibited in Australia and internationally, whose works are held in public and private collections around the world. Christabel is a sought-after senior paintings conservator who is trained in Europe, has worked on an incredible array of works from very historic works to contemporary masters. And of course, we're here today to speak about the work that Christabel has completed as a published author. And you've also written extensively on conservation as well, which is amazing. Charles and Barbara Blackman, A Decade of Art and Love, as I said, was released at the end of last year. It is a stunning, meticulously researched, lusciously crafted work of narrative non-fiction. And each chapter delves into a year in the first decade of Christabel's parents' relationship between 1949 and 1959. It is one of the most compelling engagements with Australian art history that I have read, and is particularly compelling about that scene at the time. The book includes reproductions of over 160 works by Charles Blackman, extracts of Barbara Blackman's poetry, and never-seen-before sketches and reproductions, as well as, of course, correspondence between Charles and Barbara. Please join me in welcoming Christabel, and then we'll start with some questions. If you don't mind, Christabel, we'll start with a little sort of like local moment. I know you're relatively familiar with Newcastle, not so much of a stranger. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about some of your times in the past here.
Well, my first exhibition ever, if you don't want to count when I was 4, was in Newcastle, because there was a really beautiful gallery called the Von Berto Gallery here, Anne Von Berto, who was a total figure in the art world in the whole of Australia, not just Newcastle. And she'd have an exhibition once a year called The Collector's Choice. And I remember my father opened the catalogue, he said, "Look at how many Boyds there are in here. There's, sort of Arthur Boyd and David Boyd and Lucy Boyd and Mandy Boyd. And look at the Becks, they're Boyds in disguise." And the Percivals, they could be counted as Boyds as well. He said, "There just aren't enough Blackmans." And he said, "What about that nice drawing you're doing? Why don't you put that in?" So she was the first gallery that I showed with. And we used to come here quite regularly and showed with her. I think I had a solo, we've had group shows with her, and when I worked with the limited edition prints for my family, we used to organise exhibitions, so quite a lot of trips up to Newcastle.
Fabulous, thank you. It's nice to have a home crowd. Before we delve into your book, you yourself have a fascinating story and incredible professional practice. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about your artistic practice and then also your incredible journey into paintings conservation.
I've always been surrounded by art, and actually there's a friend here, and we both we haven't seen each other in a long time, but we kind of looked at each other and said, "How did you get away from the family?" Kind of thing. But mine was that I went to Florence and I started fine art studied fine art conservation because I'd had a few pointers that were sending me that way in life. One of them was working with Indigenous paintings in the Sydney, the Aboriginal Art Centre it used to be called, in the Hogarth Galleries in Sydney. And I just saw these beautiful objects, the bark paintings, that I was concerned about, that they were sort of leaning on each other, rubbing against each other. And I looked at the owner of the gallery and I said, "You know what, Clive?" I said, "Those Mimi spirits are going to come get you unless you look after these pictures." I mean, I don't even know what Mimi spirits do, but I knew they'd do something about the pictures.
They're the cheeky ones, yes.
And then later I was staying at Arthur Boyd's house in Tuscany. And I said, "I'm going on a trip to Florence for the day." And it was the meeting on the train moment, and I met this woman who was from Oxford University, from the rowing team. You couldn't get someone more different from me. And she said, "Oh, I have to go and live in Florence for a whole month because, it's my second language, Italian, and you're obliged to do this." And I said, "Oh, that sounds great. Mind if I do it too?" And we shared a room. We found this pensione. It was called Pensione Speranza, and it was in the Via dell'Inferno, which means the Hotel of Hope in the Street of Hell. So that was the beginning of the sort of journey into Italy and studying conservation and all those wonderful things. Mm.
And because I'm a total conservation nerd, can you tell us some of the incredible things that you've encountered over your career?
Well, after being in Florence, and I think, the big thing was that thing if you can't get close enough to the paintings and you want to sort of be in them, and I wanted to have them and hold them, touch them, and so that was a big thing. But when I went and lived in, later I moved to Valencia and I spent 25 years living there. And I became a specialist in Gothic and Renaissance paintings, and they were the works that I was most familiar with. And I worked anything from sort of the 13th century all the way up. But I had a side gig, apart from working in the Museo de Bellas Artes. I worked for an antique dealer who lived in the Borgian Palace of Alexander VI, who was Lucretia Borgia's father. And he had that sort of mad menagerie sort of household where he had a beautiful wife and 4 children and pet birds and Dalmatian dogs and just art everywhere and books everywhere. And one day we were getting ready for one of the antique fairs and he said, and my son ran into this picture with his bicycle. Can you just touch it up quickly because it's going on the show tomorrow? And I picked it up and I looked at it and it said, Francisco Lucien de Goya. I thought, your son just ran into a Goya on his tricycle. So, yeah.
Lucky you were there. Amazing.
Did you touch it up?
Yeah, of course I did.
Fantastic. You've also, I suppose, talked a little bit about this book as a kind of work of conservation. I'm wondering if you can talk about the origins of the book and then some of the sources of this incredible book.
Yeah, I think the whole thing about writing the book is I always had it in the back of my mind. It was like a sort of obligation for me because I thought it was the thing that had never been done, that needed to be done, which was entangling the story, especially from the 1950s, because after that I was alive, I knew what was going on, but it was always, it's a painting from the 50s, and you go, yeah, but when? So I needed to untangle the story. I knew it would be a lot of research, and I've been picking up things or interviewing people, and then I came across the letters, my parents' love letters, which was in when my mother turned 90, and I found them all wrapped up together in the folder with a pink bow, and they were all the letters. I thought, well, that's my dad's writing. Kind of, but obviously when he was young. And then I thought, well, no one else could read those now because we get less and less used to reading handwriting. And they were all on sort of the back of a telegram form or on some bit of paper, and sometimes there were drawings sort of almost that went through the paper of his. or smudged, and you could see he didn't even have a pen. So it'd be a borrowed pen, the pen had run out, or it'd just be in pencil, and then there'd be letters from my mother saying, "I'm sending you a pen and some stamps." So I thought, well, there's a story, that's a story. And all these letters were this sort of profound confessions of love. But they were also, when my father first started to meet people from the art world. So it was his first meeting with the painter Joy Hester, the first meeting with the artist John Percival, the first time he went to Heidi. All of this was in the letters, and I thought, I read them to my mother, and she'd go, "Oh, that's sweet. That's nice." And she said, "Well, what do I do with this?" And I thought, well, it's something that should be public, really, because it's part of Australian history. It's something that shouldn't be sort of closed away. So I just want to do a little tiny book of the letters. Like, I didn't want that much work. Not like it turned out to be. But when I pitched it to James and Hudson, they said, that bit where you say after the letters, then they went on and did this, this and this, we want that part too. No, I knew you would.
Quite a journey, so about 5 years in production?
Yeah, a lot of research and a lot of transcribing of manuscripts and of the letters and searching for images and, like most people have, let's just get out the family albums, but I've lived all over the place, and if there's any family albums, they might be in Spain, perhaps, or not, and I'd ask people, have you got any photos? And they go, no, I don't have any. Have you got anything? No, I don't have any. So some of them are even, I know there's a film and I'll just put it on DVD and I'll take a picture of my iPhone of the, and send it to the publisher and say, can you do anything with this? So it was a real journey in that respect.
There's obviously your parents' voices, but there's also so many other people from this time, so many voices. There's Judith Wright's voice, there's all the artists you've just mentioned. It's a huge amount. So there must have been also archival work in other, I think the National Library are very, very friendly with you. Incredible.
Yeah, a lot. And a lot of the recorded interviews that my mother, who worked for National Archives, and she interviewed a lot of people, and I must say a lot of them are very, what? Hang on, I'll hear it again. What? A lot of them are like that, but I wanted to include the people's voices to make it very personal and very contemporary to that time. So I didn't want it just to be, quote, 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 but I wanted to, when other people could speak, let them speak in their own voices. So
amazing.
Yeah.
I love the quote from the start. History edits, memory is the greatest traitor of all. We are left with scraps and stories as rafts of imagination. My mother was over it, I was onto it. It's such a beautiful, beautiful start to the book. I'm fascinated too, obviously as a writers' festival, we could just talk about art all day, but we're going to talk about the writing. The storytelling devices, I sort of used the phrase creative nonfiction. I also came across verfabula, which I think we should just absolutely use all the time as a word. But that sense of telling the facts, using the people's voices, but telling it in a way that is compelling. It is an absolute page turner of a book. How important was that for you, and what were you reading at the time?
Yeah. Well, I think that's vital. I mean, who wants to pick up an art book and you start reading, you'd go, just look at the pictures. Who wants to read that in 1920? No. So I'd been thinking a lot about it because I am a big reader, and I was thinking, well, how am I going to tackle such a big story and so many stories that overlap? I mean, it's just such a complex time in Australian art history to include everybody. And I thought, how am I going to tell the story? And we were actually in San Francisco. We went to the City Lights bookstore, and I thought, let's just do the Brian Eno thing, let a book talk to you and let it sort of determine something. And I found this beautiful book written by an American journalist who came from a Mexican inheritance or family. And she spoke about her mother. The book was about her mother, and her mother hadn't really done anything. She was an immigrant from Mexico, and she was just a cleaner or something. But this woman had found all the complexity of her as a human being, and all the qualities and her passions and her loyalties and I thought, that's the way I've got to approach the characters in this book, and bring them to life in that way, and not just say, oh, he was a famous artist, he was a famous comedian, because what's that telling? It's not telling you anything about them. So what I wanted to do was pull out something small of their own lives, of their passions, their faults, their loves, what was driving them, what was holding them back, who they're involved with, what the attitudes and what the ambience was like around them as well. Like, who's in government, what music they're listening to, what are they wearing? Like, I wanted it to be very staged, like they were kind of staging their lives.
It's such a rich textured approach to social history that makes the works, both Barbara's and Charles's works, when they come into being, so clear and logical. I think I said to you, you were describing this moment, of the birth of their first child, and the topsy-turvy and the life turning upside down, and I was compellingly reading this sort of, yes, and wow, I'm so there. And then I turned the page, and there was this painting that I had worked with when I worked at the National Gallery in Canberra, and it was, not to be a pun, but it was a problem child painting. It's this stunning work. It's August on the chair, and he's got his head turned sideways, and so it's quite eerie. It's quite an uncomfortable work, but it's so striking. And I said to you when we met that it knocks everything off the wall. Every time we tried to hang it in the gallery, it would just, command the space. And so it was always unresolved to me what this work was doing. But in the context of this story, it just absolutely made sense. I wonder, I'm getting ahead of myself in terms of talking about the works. I promised we would talk about the writing, but in terms of that sort of sense of transformation, were there works both, of your both parents that changed the way that you saw them because of this research?
I think, I sort of always knew how great they were and how great their work was, and it's another thing that drove me was that I could see sort of all the research that was being done around Heidi in Melbourne was turning into a sort of Mona Lisa thing. It was like all about that. And I thought, well, there are a lot of other stories that, have their worth and are all equal sort of contributors for different reasons into that period in the 50s. And not just in Melbourne, in Sydney as well, and Brisbane particularly, which is where they were and where a lot of the art scene was happening at that time. So I pulled out things that I didn't realise, some connections that I didn't realise, and then, like, when I first wrote the manuscript, I sent it to Mirka Moura's son, Philippe, the filmmaker in LA, and he wrote back and he said, I'm there. Because he was 10 years older than me, and he'd remember things. But he'd said, hey, that Barry Humphries, he just wanted to be a painter. You know where he learned how to act? From your dad. I was like, okay. So you start getting other people's story, but I kind of deliberately didn't show it to too many other people because I thought this is going to get really complicated if I start having to tell everybody else. They can all tell their own stories,
I think that's lovely because what you do get is that metafiction moment where it is still you telling the story. You're absolutely, as you say, there. I wasn't there, but I'm there. But then there's these moments, and I think the one that really struck me was when you were talking about your mother as an unsighted mother and the experience of speaking with Joy Hester about having children. And if Joy's sort of, there's a fabulous phrase around, well, if I can do it, you can do it. And then you sort of say, I'm here to tell these tales because of Joy. And it, like, I'm reading my own notes and getting shivers because your words are so kind of profound. And I think that goes to that sense of this is your book? Like, yes, it's your parents' story, but this is your book. Can you talk a little bit about how important that was?
It is. I mean, there were two things there. First of all, my father used to say, if you have talent and you don't honour it by doing something with it, then you don't deserve it. You know, which is a strong thing to say, because if you're a good writer or you're a good painter, then that you should be doing that. Like, you know, don't not do it. But then I had quite strong parents, you know, to say it in sort of quite an understatement, strong parents. So I was sort of a bit inadequate in telling stories or doing anything, you know, according to my mother. So I actually had to have someone else who told me, who was an Indigenous man, and who said, your family stories are your stories. They are your stories to tell. And so I just felt like I'd been given the, you know, the fire stick or whatever it's called, and I thought, it's true, I can tell it, you know, I can tell it, and I'm really excited about telling it. And then I thought, well, I can't just write any old book, you know, because like the bar's really high, so like I've got to do like the best I can with telling the story, and the best I can in the choice of images and in publication, and you know, I think Thames and Hudson have done an amazing job with the object. They've just really.
It is
something special.
You can all go and feel it afterwards, but that sense of the letters is in each page. You know, the materiality of the pages is soft, and it feels like you're reading. And the you know, the difference between the written text and then those interspersed moments of picture and letter. It's a beautiful balance. But there's also obviously your turn of phrase, and you blew me away yesterday when you mentioned that you wrote it like an audiobook. Yeah. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about the importance of audiobooks and that approach.
Audiobooks, I mean, I love audiobooks, but we always had audiobooks since we were really little, because my mother it was the Royal Blind Society would send them, and it was the library for the blind, and they would come and they'd be great big, like, sort of roadie cases, these big sort of blocks, and they'd be full of all these books, and you'd hear War and Peace, you know, and start, and you go, oh, you know, she's going to do the ironing today, you can tell. You know, and you'd always be hearing audiobooks. So I wrote the book first to be able to read it without images, because I wanted it to be a book like that. I didn't want it to be a book that was just referring to images. So I wrote it, and I thought that it could just be published like that. And then I went through and stitched all the different images and sort them out, and some areas you'd go, oh, I haven't quite got, or even when we were doing the layout of the book, they said, oh, would be a good. I said, what if you put that sketch in there for? You know, we need something more this or more expressive. So it was, in some ways, illustrative of Charles's works, but trying to keep it as well about what we were talking about in the text. So that was, it was quite a challenge. But I think, you know, it's sort of, I'm really happy with how it's.
I think too that makes a lot of sense. I was compelled by how each sentence is sort of visually bursting. You know, I could quote so many things, but there's sort of lovely things like, on my sleepless nights when sardines become whales, and continually chasing insecure anchors in a heartless sea. Just these sort of incredible prompts for your own imagination that really ground both of their work so stunningly. So thank you. On the audiobook too, I wondered if you might speak a little bit about Alice in Wonderland.
Alice in Wonderland,
You do a beautiful job introducing Alice as one of the audiobooks they listened to, but then how profound it was for both of your parents as an inspiration, and I think probably an image that many people would associate with your father. So it's a very generous story to tell, if that's okay.
Yeah, it's a beautiful story, because it was Barbara got Alice in Wonderland out on the audiobooks, and so my father heard it at home and hadn't seen the illustrations of the book, which would be the normal thing to do, to see them. And so his imagination was just going with the images, and out of all his sort of seeking in life of finding something figurative that would express his, what you now call sort of traumas and anxieties and dreams and all those different things in life. And he'd found different vehicles, but through Alice he finally found a way to express the sort of weirdness and the changing and the disorientations and the surrealism. And I remember one that's called Everything Happened at Once, and I just keep thinking about that all the time. Everything happened at once. He was working with George Mora, Merker's husband, running in the Balzac restaurant in Melbourne, so he was cooking at the time, and so there was sort of lots of plates and tables and the eat me, drink me thing going on. And Barbara was pregnant, so she was sort of changing shape as well. And so it was a world he could completely relate to, this sort of falling down, or the thing of finding the incredible garden through the little doorway, and all this the mystery, I think, that was, and the magic that was so important for him. Mm.
And you spoke beautifully also about that sense of perception from Barbara's perspective, and that changing comprehension, and that the way that it was important for her. I had not, perhaps this is on me, but I had not really seen that maybe Barbara was Alice in a lot of these works of Charles's. Were they each other's muse at this time?
I think so. I think, your closest person to you usually is, they're the person who you interchanging your ideas with, and who you are, especially if it's a fellow creative person that you are inspiring, they're inspiring you, like I have with my beautiful partner. And that you're a continual inspiration for each other. Mm. And Charles sort of had to, he always said that he could kind of he was sort of missing things in life because he was brought up as a gutter snipe and without education, but had this yearning for the moment he was given. It was like this sort of hunger and thirst that he for literature and for music but very sophisticated things, not just sort of classics like quite and even cinema and things that he'd see quite avant-garde works and everything. So he felt that Barbara had sort of brought all that to him and was that world to him, and she he was bringing the whole visual world to her. Mm. And seeing she was blind, they would go arm in arm everywhere. And he'd explain things that he'd see. And because he'd worked on the Herald as an illustrator and touching up the photos, and I don't know, you can still see them in photographs in the newspaper, black and white photos. It's the fastest way to do it. They go, a bit of black round there, a bit of white there, so you've got the contrast that looks good in black and white. And so he had a way of thinking like that as well. He'd see vignettes, they'd walk together and he'd go, there's a woman in the window and she's arranging some flowers. There's a doorway that's just opened there and a dog has run up. Like he would explain things in these sort of vignettes. And then she, who'd studied psychology and literature, she would translate these things into what they meant. The sort of silent rearranging of the moment, or the sort of, escape of desire, or whatever she'd explain them as, or she would recite a poem or recite a passage of literature to go with it. So it was this sort of marriage of the minds in a lot of ways, and muses, if that's what you want to call it, yeah.
Marriage of the minds is very nice. Yeah. You were describing, I think, some of the scenes that we see. We have two works from the Newcastle collection reproduced in this book beautifully. One of them is the running boy. Yes, lots of nods, some familiar you're all very welcome back in the gallery when we reopen. But this is in a beautiful section where you are channeling the artist minds of the time, and that exact story you sort of just convey around seeing the streets as art and the communication between them. The other sorts of works are these wonderful ones that I'm also pleased to have had as friends at the National Gallery in Canberra, and seeing those billboards, but they weren't well received at the time, you also describe, and that sort of sense of the contrast of the time. There's a lot of the beauty and the grit and the truth of the moment that I think you convey that you don't often get in an art historical text.
I think, like, apart from Charles in that era, when he's starting to use images which are the street images, he was totally a precursor to Warhol and Lichtenstein and people who later went on to do that in American art, using advertising as the sort of the social statement or the currency for visual language. But he turned at those Melbourne landscapes, and often they are industrial landscapes. You know, they've got sort of the tiers of the factory and the towers, and he turned them. I mean, he had quite a lot of friends who were architects as well, and they would talk about the urban architecture. And I think he really sort of turned them into the stage set for his what he was saying. But there was another thing that happened, which was the Alan McCulloch, who wrote the Encyclopedia of Australian Art. He was working at the Herald, he was the critic at the Herald, and they started this outdoor art show, and it was like the Magic Mile of masterpieces. They'd have all these sort of wire walls that were set up, and they were just covered in paintings. And there was a section which was for the new artists, because the new artists, they didn't know how to get their art to the public. The institutions and everything were saying, oh, we don't want that, we want that, you know, things that are painted properly. You know, so they how are we going to get these sorts of images out there? And that was one of the vehicles. But they invented other ways. They said, well, how can we get people to see our pictures? I know, let's hire a car showroom, because it's full of glass windows. We're going to hang all the paintings up so people, when they go past, will see the art. I mean, what gallery doesn't have a window in it now? You know, what painting always sells one in the window? So it's like they went, and they were a group who changed history, not only Charles, but the other artists of that time. And I think that's really important to point those things out. You know, they started off the artist statement, or the self-hosting exhibitions, and it sort of all culminated in them doing a manifesto. And this manifesto was the manifesto in whitefellow, you know, Australian art history, and it's just remained there. Like no one else has come to sort of slay that dragon. But it was a manifesto about figurative art instead of abstract art, to say that it was the figurative art that needed to express the emotional state that Australia was in, that needed to define, that needed to, post-war times, needed to define the Australians' individualism. You know, the thing about sort of isolation and distance and frustration and violence and all those sorts of things. All Charles and all the other artists of that era were preoccupied with those themes.
Amazing. You focused on that very particular time, 1949 to 59. How hard was it to stop there?
No, I'd get up and I'd still be in the same position, you know. My hands were like this, and I'd go, oh, I just have to go straight to my time, sir, yet again. You know, it was like, it's a lot of work. And so right from the beginning I said, I'm just going to bite off a piece of history and look at what are the parentheses of those, that'll do it, and like keep myself in that, because if you've got a limit, then it's something you can do. If there's no limit, you never know where the boundary is.
Yeah. Can we talk a little bit about Newcastle Art Gallery's work, the Nighttime at Flinders? You, in the way that you introduce works, you're often introducing a body of work, or, you know, a piece of text, things that are sort of more broadly in the environment and the changes in both Barbara and Charles's practice. But you very specifically call out Night Tide at Flinders, which is the work in the gallery's collection. Why?
Well, it's, apart from it being a really beautiful painting, when you mentioned it before and you said, oh, have you been to the beach? And I thought, well, now you'd say, have you been to the beach in Newcastle? But, 30 years ago you wouldn't have said that. You'd say, don't go near the port or something. It would have been very, very different. So when they bought it, it was a sort of bit of a precursor of what's happened here, and it's become such a fabulous, sort of vibrant place. But Charles had been through a complete change of style and of painting at that time, because he'd been painting with Ripolin, which were sort of enamel colours, and paints were acrylics and things like that were invented sort of mid or a little bit earlier last century. Like, they haven't been around for all that long, so they were sort of playing with enamels, which is what Sydney Nolan, they used to call him Sydney Linoleum, would paint with all these dulux colours, like we used to paint chairs and things with, or doors. And tempera, Charles had set tempera, which is made out of egg yolks. That so you mix the pigments with the egg yolk, and you paint with that, which has to be done quite quickly. So a lot of his paints were done like that. And the artists would talk about techniques, and they'd always talk about Rembrandt's, secret mixture. And so I knew there was a letter somewhere from Russell Drysdale, and I'd heard about it, and I found it in the archives at Heidi, and it was this really long letter about what to do and how to boil the oil and the resin and mix them and make them. And it also said, you sort of make sure you give a drink to your wife, because she's not going to like what you're doing. The place is going to stink, But he would make his own rabbit skin glue and gessos and all those sorts of things. So he had this new freedom that the paint was giving him. And if you look at it, it's got these beautiful big sort of areas of blue and just this glowing moonlight and a figure. And the painting was done after he'd spent a weekend with the Hattams down in Shoreham, where they had a little shack on the beach. And the Hattams were, Hal Hattam had delivered me, he was a gynaecologist, a very prestigious gynaecologist in Melbourne, and his wife was the fashion buyer from George's prestigious store. And but Hal used to he'd go out painting with John Percival and Arthur Boyd and Charles and things. But he was also one of the first people to practice abortions in Australia, which I sort of found out later. But yeah, they went away for a weekend, so he had this sort of vision, because they'd go out in the evening, go for walks, and I don't think people sat around watching television. Go out to go for walks, and he came back and painted that beautiful painting. And how incredible, what a wonderful foresight for the Newcastle Gallery to have to purchase that and have it in their collection, because it's a real gem.
Thank you. I could listen to you talk about materials all day. I love that has become so much a part of this book, the shifts not only in thematic but also in material, the way you describe why he was working in certain things, and how the eggs came from Joy Hester's or Sunday Reed's hen house, and then that as they started to become more successful, he was able to maybe buy some oil paints. And so that sense of moving through an artist's practice from a material sense and the knowledge of those materials is divine. Thank you. A little bit about the reception and the feedback. Obviously, very popular, wonderful reviews, but you've also talked about this being an important text for your family.
Yeah, it is. It's it's wonderful. It's wonderful to be able to offer this to everyone, to all the information, and not keep it as a sort of private thing. And also, I just want to acknowledge the collaboration of my family to allow me to use so many images in the book, because often art books, they can't reproduce as many things because they struggle with copyright and all those sort of barriers to be able to give so much. And almost everybody was extraordinary in collaborating. My younger brother is no longer alive, and when when he passed away quite suddenly, I thought, I've just got to do this book, I've just got to get it done. And when I showed it to my older brother, who's the only other sibling from Charles and Barbara, he looked at me and he just sort of hugged me and he wept and he said, I can't believe you've done this. This is so fantastic. And then my father married 3 times, so I have other brothers and a sister who don't know these stories. I mean, even though it's about, another previous wife for them, they don't know those stories about their father. And I remember the first copy that I got, I gave it to my daughter when I was over in Europe. I gave it to my daughter and I thought, I wrote in it, this is your story too, because it's their story too. And I think a lot of it's part of the story of Australian identity as well. So it's got to be there. It's just got to be there as part of our collective story.
Thank you. I've heard people ask you when's Volume 2 coming out, but I feel like perhaps more on the cards is some fabulous stories about tricycles and Goya, your own adventures. What is next for you?
I think doing as much as I can to get the book into the public, which is important. It will be writing. I'll keep writing. So this book I wrote in Ireland, which is a great haven to go to write, because the Irish are the most illiterates. They're just, everybody knows how to use words, and it's just extraordinary. So you're kind of, it's like if you're a florist and you're lying in a field of flowers, you're like writing, and just all the words you hear around them is inspiring every time someone opens their mouth, even if they're selling you a bunch of parsley, it's incredible. So probably another book in Ireland, maybe fiction, maybe biographical, but I think a break, like if I did go on to do the 60s, I've got to write a few other things first. But words were very much a part of my life, always.
I can see some rapid movements over the right-hand side here, which means it's a very nice way to end. Please join me in thanking Christabel Blackman.
Thank you for listening to this bonus episode of Conversations from the Collection. If you enjoyed spending time with us, be sure to check out our other episodes, and as always, don't forget to subscribe or leave us a review to help other listeners find us. Conversations from the Collection is a Newcastle Art Gallery production, and we pay our deepest respects to the traditional custodians of the land on which this podcast was produced, the Awabakal and Worimi people. This project is supported by the New South Wales Government through Create New South Wales.